Are waiting just for a few more folks to join us. So we'll be back shortly to get the webinar kicked off. Just bear with us a few more minutes. We'll be back soon. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our BHCC Clinical Integration Learning Collaborative webinar. My name is Meg Beyer, and I am part of the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center team here at the NYU McSilver Institute, and I'm thrilled to be joined by some of my fellow presenters who will introduce themselves shortly. So again, thanks to everyone for joining today. We're going to get started. So just a few logistics before we begin. For those of you who have joined us for webinars in the past, this is going to sound like something you've heard before because you have. So we're recording these webinars. They're going to be shared following the conclusion of the webinar, both the recording and the slides. We are going to ask for your participation throughout the webinar today. So we ask for that in two forms. One, if you're comfortable chatting in or sending in your questions, great. We ask that you do that. We'll be collecting questions throughout the course of the webinar today. And also throughout the webinar, we are going to have one or two different points where we will unmute everyone's line. And if you have questions, we ask that you speak up and ask your question from the presenter. So you'll know at the point in the presentation when we do that, because we'll make an announcement that everyone is about to be unmuted. So the other thing is, just so that we get a sense of who the question is coming from, we just ask that you identify yourself and the BHCC you're representing. Just gives us a better sense of who the question is coming from again. So with that, I'm actually going to pass the presenter ability to my colleague, Erica, who will introduce herself and take us through the content for the rest of the webinar. So Erica, go right ahead.
Thank you, Meg, and good afternoon, everyone. This is Erica Vanderwall-Ward from the Office of Mental Health PSYCKES team. And also with me today is Mark Voss.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Voss. I'm from Oasis Counsel's office, and I'm here to help with any questions that arise about 42 CFR Part 2.
Thank you, Mark. Here's our agenda for today. So we wanted to start with information about the final version of the BHCC consent form. So I'll go through just some updates for the group, instructions for preparing the form, some of the common questions we got about the form and the answers to those questions, and then we'll open up the line for any additional question and answer that folks have. The second agenda item is put together just some considerations to think about as you prepare to implement this BHCC consent form that might be good to discuss. And then we'll end with just a sneak preview of the PSYCKES-specific feature we're developing to support this BHCC consent form. So just on the topic of PSYCKES, I'll show you some screenshots of what that feature will look like related to this. So just on the BHCC consent form, and we met back in December to discuss the BHCC consent form, and at that point we had sent out draft 1, got a lot of great feedback. We developed a second draft, sent it out to you again on December 28th, and got even more feedback and questions on that form. So this has been a really, informing process. Thank you everyone for your feedback that you were sending in. So we reviewed thoroughly with OMH Legal Counsel, with Mark from OASAS Legal Counsel. We're instrumental in understanding your feedback and incorporating your feedback into the final version of the form. And when MCTAC announced this webinar, they sent out the final version of the BHCC consent form, and also a withdrawal of consent form too, that you can use as a tool for obtaining consent. And so we'll go through those instructions on how to use that form. So just again to reiterate that OMH and OASAS Legal Counsel were both involved in creating this form, working through the feedback, and finalizing the BHCC consent form. So that was circulated on March 4th. Of course, let us know if you didn't get it. And so really the intention of this form is to help the BHCCs and your network providers for information sharing by and among your providers, provider to provider, BHCC to provider, provider to BHCC. So getting that client's permission for bidirectional exchange of information in your network, in your BHCC network, to assist with that client's care. So just some basic instructions for filling out that BHCC consent form that was sent out. So it is a fillable PDF. So just to kind of help fill it out before you print it out, you can use those blanks in the fillable PDF form to type in the information and then print it out, and that just looks a little nicer instead of having to hand write it. Of course, handwritten is okay too, but it's really how do I fill out these blanks in this form and get it prepared before we start implementing, and that's what I wanted to just give some basic instructions. So first you have to put the name of your BHCC. There's several blanks throughout the form on pages 1 and pages 2 where you can put in the name of your BHCC, but the way this PDF, it's kind of like a smart form where in the very first line, if you type in your BHCC's name, it will automatically populate throughout the form in all the places where the BHCC name is needed in the form, just by filling it out one time in the first blank. The other thing you'll want to do is put your BHCC's public website address, your web address, www. And what your web address is in the consent form. And if you put that in the first blank where it asks for it, in the second paragraph, it'll again populate in all the places on the form, pages 1 and 2, where the website is asked for. There's a place for your BHCC's phone number on page 2, number 2. It's another way that clients could find out who are all the providers in your BHCC network, so they could go to the website, or they could call the BHCC, or they could ask their provider who all might potentially look at my information. So those are the two ways. So you have your website and you'll have your phone number. And then finally, the last bullet on this slide is there's information on page 2 for the client, because of course with any consent form, it says on the back you're going to give a copy, or the provider will offer a copy to the client. So there's space to give a phone number or some contact information for the client to have available to them. Number 5, it'll be if they feel that their information was accessed without permission, what phone number should they call? And number 7, if they do decide they want to withdraw their consent from the BHCC in the future, who should they call? So you can decide if that number will be best to be the BHCC or the actual provider who's requesting this consent. So then you just want to figure out what's the best phone number and put that on page 2 and number 5 and number 7. So related to instructions and getting prepared to use this form, the BHCC website must have an area where you list your network providers. So that's how this will work, where you put the website on the form, and then a client would have the ability to go to your website to see who are all these providers that are in your network. And you want to distinguish between who are treatment providers and who are non-treatment providers on your website, and you want to keep this information up to date. So you might want to organize it like, first list all of the agency names of your network treatment providers and the agency name of your network non-treatment providers. Like if you had a care management program or an HCBS that was in your network, if they're not providing treatment, but yet they still might need this information about the client to help with coordination of care, list those in a separate section so that someone can distinguish who are the treatment providers, who are the non-treatment providers. And some BHCCs have expressed interest of wanting affiliates to also be able to be involved in this data exchange. They would have to be listed and kept up to date on this section of your website, and you could then have a section for affiliates on that page. So it's really making sure you have your network providers listed on your website, breaking it out like this, and putting that website on the consent form. Relating to the RIO and this form, and I'm going to talk about RIOs again when we get to the common question, frequently asked questions section, but just for the purpose of the filling out the consent form, if you are working with your local RIO and you have permission from that RIO to use this consent form as a way of sharing information that has been collected from the RIO by and among providers in your network, what you would do is insert the name of the RIO in the second blank on the second paragraph, and then it will populate throughout the form where needed. There's one other place where the name of the RIO would populate on page 2. So you just have to put that in second blank of the second paragraph to populate in both places. There's also a place for the RIO's website on page 2, number 2. If you are not planning to do data exchange, sharing data that has come from the RIO by and among your providers, then you can leave those blank in the consent form, and that's what I would do if you do not have permission from your local RIO. So now I wanted to get to some FAQs, some frequently asked questions that we have been getting from BHCCs, bringing up terrific points, terrific questions, and after pulling these questions back, consulting with Mark and also Denise from our OMH Council, these are the answers that we've been giving back on some of these frequently asked questions, and then we'll open it up to see if anyone has additional questions. So people have asked, what happens with this consent form and this consent status after the BHCC project, quote, ends? And I put ends in quotes because it doesn't really have an end date. In fact, it's really the startup funds and the startup project that might, kind of come to an end, but it's really the BHCC can remain. The entity that you've reformed can remain, and as long as your kind of like entity status remains the same, that BHCC consent form will remain active for you. So your network continues as is, then the consent continues. It doesn't end. But what happens if you change to a different type of legal entity? Like let's say you're a BHCC now, but not an IPA, and what happens if you become an IPA? What happens to that consent form? Well, what I learned is that a new consent is needed anytime an organization changes its legal entity or its legal status. So that will be true in this scenario too. If you change your legal authority or change your legal status from a BHCC, maybe you're an incorporated, or change to an IPA, you're changing your legal status, reconsent would be needed. So clients would need to sign a new form, even if the name is very similar. It's a new legal status, so that has to change. Another common question we get is the OASAS universal consent, that TRS 64, also needed in addition to the BHCC consent form? So that answer is no. If your providers in your network are using the BHCC consent form, they would not also need the TRS 64. So you wouldn't need to do both. The BHCC consent was designed for data sharing between BHCC and provider to BHCC, and provider to provider within your BHCC. That was the intention of this BHCC consent form. And the TRS-64, when that was developed, the intention for that was to be a consent tool for providers to use. It's available for providers to use if they need it. I just do want to note, though, the TRS-64 does not cover PSYCKES access. So depending on what your intention is and how you want to use these consent tools, I just did want to point that out. If you want to use this BHCC consent form, one of the things in there is PSYCKES language. That would be the way to go as far as PSYCKES goes. Okay, and we'll have a chance if there's any follow-up questions about that. And Mark, did you want to add anything about that to that bullet point?
Well, I think it's just, the idea that the universal consent was to put out there sort of just as a platform that people could work off. And so in this case, the BHCC consent form takes essentially the basis of what's in the TRS-64 and converts it to the specific use that's in play here. So I don't think that anybody who is really looking for a BHCC consent form needs to look at the TRS-64 any longer.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you for that information. Another question we got a few times that we wanted to make sure we were clear, and sometimes there is some confusion in the language of the form, so we added some additional language when we put out the final version to help clarify this. Is this form taking the approach from new SAMHSA regulations and disclosure about a general designation where instead of listing providers by name or by organization, there's this language, all my treatment providers. So was the BHCC consent form taking that approach? No, we are not. So the approach you're taking to be able to communicate to the client what providers might have access to my information, it's those providers giving you care that are in this BHCC network. And you can find out who that is. The client can find out who that is by going to the BHCC website. Or on page 2, it says you can also ask your provider, or you can contact the BHCC, and there's a phone number there. So that's really 3 ways where they could find out. And in order for this to work and be covered, that website has to be up to date of who are all the current providers in your network. So that's how it's working. And that's different from the general designation approach where it's just all my treatment providers is more general. Okay, so I wanted to clarify that question. And then, does this form replace the RIO consent forms that providers already use? And the answer to that question is no. So there's already consent forms in place that providers have. They get the client's permission to go in and access information from the RIO, to go into that system and get that information. The intention of the BHCC consent form was not to replace those existing RIO consent forms that might already be in use. Rather, the intention of the BHCC consent form, if you're working with a RIO and they say it's okay to put that RIO in this form, is really to get permission from the client to share information that might have been obtained from the RIO by one provider with other providers in that network or with the BHCC and vice versa. So it's really about the sharing within the network than first obtaining that information, and that's the intention of that original RIO consent form. So I hope that makes sense, but let me know. So just one last FAQ. How does a parent or legal guardian sign the BHCC consent form on behalf of a child or youth? So I think the first recommendation is that the providers, what I've learned, have certain policies and procedures around how children and youth sign consent, whether it's there's a certain age threshold or what their policies and procedures are in place. We're not trying to change anything there. We have a section in the BHCC consent form where the client signs. In that signature section at the end of page 2, there's also a place for legal guardian. So it's signature of patient or legal guardian. And so if you have the situation where a parent or guardian needs to sign on behalf of their child, they can sign as the legal representative, and in the box that says name and relationship, they can put parent or guardian there. So the form does allow for that in its final version. So those are some of our common questions. Do we have any other questions that have been typed in, Meg and Brad, so far?
Hi, Erica.
So I think the one question that we got, and I'm not sure if you've seen it, but was that a question, if I'm a partner in one BHCC and an affiliate in another BHCC, can I put consent for both on one form?
No, so I think, and Mark, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that a BHCC consent form is for one BHCC. So if a provider agency is part of two BHCCs, and you need to see one client's data for both, there's two different forms. So the client would sign more than one form if they're providers, if they're getting services from a provider that's part of two BHCCs. Would you agree with that, Mark, or do you have any other advice about that question?
I think from an operational perspective, yeah, that's the way you would want it. Yep.
Great
because
question.
the likelihood of a client receiving services in both from distinct members is pretty tricky. So I think the best approach would be to keep it per BHCC.
Okay. Thank you both, Erica and Mark. We did get another question chatted in. And the question was if the qualified entities, like RIOs, provided feedback on the BHCC consent form.
So I didn't talk to every single RIO when creating this form, but what I did was touch base with the Department of Health, and overall they did review the form. The point people for their shiny, Jim Kirkwood, did review the form and said it would be okay to include it, but that's where we got the instructions that if a BHCC wants to type in a RIO into that line, or qualified entity into that blank, that you would have to check with that directly. Check with that RIO or qualified entity directly.
Okay, and I think this subsequent question kind of ties in with that a bit, but just to be clear and read all of our questions that we get chatted in. So just to be clear, this consent covers only PSYCKES access, the TRS-64, and maybe the RIO, if they provide permission. But to be clear, it does not cover other consent forms like the health home consent form. Is that correct?
So this is Mark. No, generally consent forms are tailored to a specific purpose. So the BHCC consent form is for utilization with the BHCC. It's not necessarily for utilization with the health home, and if there's an overlap there in services being provided, the health home consent form would also be required, or for any other particular specific integrated care system.
All right, thanks, Mark. We did get another question that we've had chatted in. Let me just take a moment to read it. So if this BHCC has affiliate partners who are large medical practices, are the physicians in these practices covered if the BHCC identifies as both treatment providers and affiliates? I'm not sure, Erica and Mark, if that question makes sense, or we might need to unmute the line and get a little clarity.
I think clarity would help.
Okay. So, Brad, what I'll ask you to do right now is if you could unmute the lines. And what we're going to do is I'll ask the person who just asked the question I read if they could clarify what they meant by their question.
Yes, hi. Bruce Nesbitt from Value Network, IPA. We have a couple large medical practices, Catholic Medical Partners and UB Meds, who have a number of physicians in those practices who are treatment providers for our members. So the question is, if we list them on our website as under the treatment provider category and affiliates, will that cover their access under this release?
And their access would be for treatment purposes?
Yes, for treatment purposes.
Yeah, then they would be covered.
Okay, and we can do it by their practice name.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, as long as it's for treatment purposes. Yep.
All right, great. All right, thank you. That's helpful.
All right, and what I might ask is if you are not up at the moment, if you wouldn't mind picking up the phone, having a lot of background noise. Thank you. All right, so I might see if there's any other questions that folks want to ask at this point. I did get one more question chatted in, so I'll read that. If providers come into or out of a BHCC network, and that is updated on the BHCC website, what process is needed, if any, to inform the client of those changes?
Well, I think this is Mark. I think the BHCCs have to make a point of advising the clients that the members within the BHCC are reflected by the listing that the BHCC puts up, and that listing will change from time to time. Mm-hmm. So it falls back on the client to actually determine who's in and who's out.
Thanks, Mark. We have one more question that was chatted in. So this person is asking, their providers have their own consent forms. So they're asking if they can embed the language from the BHCC consent form into an existing form.
So this is Mark again. So generally, right, each consent form that's tailored, like the BHCC consent form, outlines a specific purpose and the information that's going to be conveyed through the identified parties. And I think if they can capture that embedding into their own consent form without deviation to any great extent, then it's not a problem. It's always a little bit of difficulty answering a question like this without seeing the document.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we're getting a couple more questions. Another question we got was whether, let's see here, the release includes, quote, all information, end quote. Does that include information from non-BHCC providers and others, like criminal justice sources?
The information that will be included is really listed on the form. So on page 1, it says the types of information paragraph. Page 1 of the consent form, paragraph 3, gives examples of the types of information that can be accessed by way of this form, health records, and gives a couple of examples like illnesses or injuries you might have, test results you might have, assessment results, medicines you may have taken, and then lists out some more specific examples. We didn't put in there information on incarcerations, if that's the question. But if that's information that would be contained within either PSYCKES or the RIO at some point, what we do for PSYCKES and how we work our PSYCKES consent form and are incorporating that in this form too, is we always keep all of our data sources up to date on our PSYCKES website. And then our PSYCKES website is referenced on page 2 of the BHCC consent form number 2. So a client, to know all of our data sources, can always go to our PSYCKES website, or the provider can print it out for them if that's easier for them. So new data sources that might pop up will be reflected there. I'm just speaking for PSYCKES though. So I don't know, Mark, if you would have anything else to add about if this would cover like incarceration information, if they knew it from any other source, would they be able to share that?
Right. So obviously, information being sourced through a RIO, it's difficult to really determine what information is going to be sourced. So that's hard to say.
Okay. Thank you both for your answers on that. I'm going to take one more question. We got a couple questions about client opt-out. So the question is, can a client opt out of consent for a specific provider in the BHCC, or is this an all or nothing consent form?
There isn't a mechanism on the form to opt out of a specific provider, but I wonder if that could be handled at the BHCC level somehow by tracking it throughout the network, tracking information about consent throughout the network. We haven't set it up that way. I think it was really set up as an all or nothing because the consent form has the website on there and then the list of the providers is on the website.
Okay. All right, so I think we've answered as many questions as we could at this point, and I know there's more content to get through. Erica and Mark, would you like to move ahead?
Sure, that's fine.
Great.
So I have a few more slides, but then I think we'll have time for more Q&A at the end if questions are still coming in. That's great. We definitely want to make sure we use this opportunity to answer all of your questions.
Perfect. I think that's a great plan, Erica.
All right, I'm going to go on to some implementation consideration, because this is something that has always been on my mind since we started talking about BHCC consent. So just thinking through it, and I'm sure many, if not all of you have already thought of this, but I just wanted to make sure to say it out loud. So how do you want to implement this form? What is the messaging that you want to send to your providers about use of this form? So are you planning on distributing it in an email? Are you planning on talking about it in some type of regular meeting that you have with your network providers to help them know the intention of the form, how to fill it out, how to really get buy-in on maybe changing consent practices or adding this into their current consent workflow, their current intake packets, and so forth. So just things to think about how you're messaging this to your providers, because it is a change, and it might be either a new form, yet another form, or if you're really just, one of the main use cases of this is PSYCKES, although it covers more than just PSYCKES, but thinking about how providers may already have an active PSYCKES consent that just covers data sharing within their own provider agency. If you want to expand that consent for just related to PSYCKES to your BHCC, then they would need to sign this form now. So do you want your providers to just replace their current PSYCKES consent forms with the new one and get how would they handle reconsent? Do you have any recommendations on that? We will provide, as the PSYCKES team, monthly training. We already provide monthly training on consent as it pertains to PSYCKES, and we will be happy to help with the technical aspect of how providers will indicate that this consent form was obtained in PSYCKES. But outside of PSYCKES, and just thinking about tracking and workflow and communication within your network about consent, I think some of you have started to think about, from the BHCC network level, how could we track certain things network-wide, and consent might be one of them. So for example, if a client being served by one of your providers in your network has already signed your BHCC consent form, how do you help the rest of the network know that that client has already signed the form, and therefore they don't have to sign it again at another provider agency? And then if that client maybe they declined the first time, and you want to, because they're brand new maybe to the agency, and you want to ask them again maybe in a few months just to see maybe now they want to sign. So kind of things like that, thinking about tracking consent, revocation of consent network-wide, are just some considerations for implementing the consent form. Lastly, I just wanted to give a preview of the PSYCKES specific feature to support this BHCC consent form. So many of the BHCCs have worked with us to develop a specialized BHCC consent form, or to develop a specialized BHCC PSYCKES access. And so just specifically talking about the PSYCKES component of this consent flow, once your providers start to use that BHCC consent, and you're a BHCC that's using our special network view, the BHCC access wide network view. I wanted to give a preview of how that feature will work for one of your providers to attest in PSYCKES that that consent form was signed for your BHCC. So April 2nd, we're going live with a new PSYCKES features release, as we always do about 3 to 4 times a year. We put out new features in PSYCKES, and on April 2nd, that'll be our next go live release, and when we're going live with the new feature to allow a provider level user to attest to a BHCC consent. So what they would do is when they log into PSYCKES after April 2nd and they look up a client and they want to attest that they have the client's consent, here's where they're going to see another option. They're used to seeing the PSYCKES consent form as an option. They'll also, after this date, see the BHCC, a specific BHCC name, as an option. Once they check off that option, then if you are using the BHCC PSYCKES access view we created for you, then in real time in that moment, a user from the BHCC access view will be able to see data that has special protections on that client, or be able to see that client's information even if they don't have a quality flag. So that just really sends that consent really, in essence, to you as the BHCC. So you can see that client's full clinical summary, including data that has special protections, such as substance use information, and also would allow you as a BHCC to see client identified reports related to data with special protections. Like we just added a new indicator set on substance use disorders and opioid use disorders. That indicator set really is just aggregate data unless you have client permission. So with this consent flow, the BHCC would be able to see client identified reports on any client that has consented to your BHCC network. We can provide training to you as the BHCC to see more about this after it goes live, and also training and technical assistance to your providers on how to use this new feature. So we can do extra webinars on this for your providers if that will be helpful, but we also have an existing webinar that we give every single month just about consent and PSYCKES. It's called Enable Access to Client Level Data in PSYCKES. That's a live webinar we offer every month, and people can register through our calendar section. We also have a recorded version, so we'll make an updated recording and put this in our recorded webinars section of our PSYCKES website. So that's how providers that's another way that providers will be able to log into the webinar and learn how to use this new feature. So here's the preview. Here's a screenshot of PSYCKES and what this will look like after April 2nd, this special feature. So we'll go in, log into PSYCKES, go to recipient search, that's like they always do, look up a client, and search for that client. Medicaid ID is the best way, but you can also use SSN or name and date of birth. So you look up a client like they're used to, get a results page like this. This is just de-identified or scrambled for the demo purposes, but they would make sure they found the right person. Yes, this is who I'm looking for, and they click all the way to the right, change PHI access level. So I'm a provider attesting to why I have the right to view this client's data, right? I'm in PSYCKES, I'm attesting to why I'm allowed to view it. And this is just an example, just pretend names here, like let's pretend I'm Jewish Board and let's pretend I'm part of 2 BHCCs. Just for an example, let's pretend I'm part of CBC and I'm part of IDUHA. So I'm a user from Jewish Board, I'm going in, and my client signed the IDUHA BHCC consent form. So the BHCC Patient Information Sharing Consent Form, under which I'm a provider, this is the form they signed. I check this box, continue, I attest how I know they're the right person at the bottom. That hasn't changed, step 2 hasn't changed in any way, and then I submit it. So that's the new feature that's coming April 2nd, and will enable that PSYCKES access to the BHCC, but this is all done by work of the provider user. They're getting the consent form signed, they're attesting that consent was obtained, and that's how this was all planned out. My last slide is just contact information. If you have any PSYCKES related questions, you can always contact our help desk, psyches-help@omh.ny.gov, or you can call me, and here's my number. Any legal questions about consent or about substance use information and consent, Mark from OASAS, phone number is here. So thank you, Mark, for all of your help on this form. I've learned a lot in this process, and it has been just invaluable. And I thank everyone for all of your feedback on this form. So now we have plenty of time for any final questions.
So before I ask Brad, I think we'll have time to unmute the lines again, but we did have some questions chatted in that I wanted to see if we could address first.
Thank you.
So we'll do those first before unmuting the lines. So the first question, I think someone has found the BHCC consent form, but the issue is the version they found has the word draft on it. Is there a file available where the word draft has been removed?
Yes, the final version should have at the bottom February 2019. That's the final version. February 2019 in the footer of the document was sent out by MCTAC on March 4th. So if they didn't get that email, Meg, do we want to just resend it to them?
Yeah.
I can also send to our contact list. Yeah, okay, so we'll just resend it out maybe.
So what I was going to recommend is that when we send out this recording and the slides, we just attach the form again. Would that make sense, Erica and Mark?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, perfect. So for the person who asked that question, fear not, we'll be circulating we'll be recirculating the most up-to-date slide, the form that we have shortly. Okay. Next question was, so someone's wondering if you might have a recommendation for a workflow process for the BHCCs to utilize to best manage entering the PSYCKES consent into an SMS.
Not into SMS, but into the PSYCKES application. Yeah, SMS is used to manage PSYCKES level access, and then the consents will be entered in through PSYCKES. So I think there's a lot of different workflows that could be used depending on the provider's kind of current workflow. So anytime we talk about integrating PSYCKES consent into a clinic workflow, that's what I have some experience in. And even though this form is even greater than PSYCKES, I'll say the provider would be the one obtaining the client's consent on the form. And they're used to having clients sign other forms already, in intake, for example. So any new clients come in, what might work best, and we've heard from providers that this works well, to integrate the form in with other forms the clients are already filling out and signing, like a consent for treatment, for example. So, and then if someone is not a new client, they're an existing client, when's another opportunity to get them to sign additional new forms? Do they do that on treatment review? Is it something that they could do maybe just at their next appointment? So getting feedback from that provider and the people actually that do that paperwork flow might be best. And then you want the provider to have someone assigned to enter that consent into PSYCKES. Do they do that one at a time when they need the record, or they do it in batches? Like, I'm going to sit down once a week on Monday or on Friday afternoon, and all the consents that we got signed, I'm going to enter those into PSYCKES one at a time. Some providers have had a clerical person do that. Maybe they don't need to look at the clinical data themselves, but they could go in, look up the client, and then 3 steps, like I just showed you, attest that consent was obtained, what BHCC consent was obtained. So it could work like that. But as far as the network-wide tracking, I don't have a particular recommendation. You just, like, what's going to work for your BHCC as far as knowing that consent was obtained for a client network-wide? Would it be like an Excel tracking somehow, or a web-based way? I know some BHCCs have developed some web-based tools for tracking information such as consent. So,
Erica, thank you. That was really helpful. And I think it makes sense, like, it's going to be what works best for the BHCC. So thank you for sharing all those potential options. Our next question that we got chatted in was, can BHCC level staff select the attest consent button for a patient?
We built the feature so that it would be from a provider user perspective. So with your special BHCC access view, that's just for people who work at the BHCC kind of leadership role, that there is no way in your view right now to be able to attest to consent. Because what we heard is a lot of times the people who are working for the main BHCC are not necessarily people working one-on-one with clients. We could incorporate that in the future if that's useful. If you say, I'm the BHCC, I want to attest to this consent myself in my PSYCKES view, we could add that. So if that makes sense, it's really from a provider's login, not from a BHCC login, but we could add that.
Got it. Thank you. And I'm going to take 2 more of the chatted-in questions, and then I'm going to ask Brad to open the line. So I know there's a lot of questions coming in. If we can't address them all, I think it would be helpful if we could have a little conversation at the end. So we're collecting them all, and we might be able to answer them after the webinar. But I wanted to say and acknowledge that I know a lot of questions are coming in at this point. So another question we had is that, let's see here. So someone asked, would this feature ultimately track who has consent signed and what provider they were signed with? Erica and Mark, does that give you enough to kind of answer that question, or?
Can you say it one more time?
Yeah. So someone asked, would this feature, and I'm not sure what feature they're particularly referencing, ultimately track who has consent signed and what provider they were signed with?
I'm guessing they're talking about the PSYCKES feature, and no, the functionality would not be a tracking mechanism.
Okay, thank you. So another question: if we separate treating and non-treating providers on the website, can data be shared still with the non-treating providers? For example, a health home.
I'm sorry, could you read that again, please?
Yeah. So if we separate treating and non-treating providers on our website, then can data still be shared with non-treating providers? For example, a health home.
As long as the client understands that among the list of non-treating providers may include those individuals that will be shared with. Yeah, as long as they're identified. Yep.
Okay. The next question, let's see here. If a BHCC does not get a patient's consent, does their data just show up as de-identified in PSYCKES?
It depends on a couple of situations. So the way the BHCC access view for PSYCKES works is you tell us who your network providers are, and you tell us if you have a data sharing agreement with those providers. If you have a data sharing agreement with the provider, you can see information on the clients that provider has served if the client has a quality flag. In the absence of consent, you can see client-level information for clients that have a quality flag that have been served by your providers you have a data sharing agreement with. That's how it was already set up when we went live last year. This consent takes that a step further. So in addition to that use case, with consent, you can see more information, and you can see information for clients that maybe don't have a quality flag. So I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Erica. Okay, I think what would make sense at this point is we have about 5 to 6 minutes, and I'd like to ask Brad, if it's okay with Erica and Mark, to open up the phone lines so that we could, if there's any questions that folks wanted to ask versus chat in, we could have that happen. So as Brad takes everyone off mute, what I'll do is what I asked last time. If you could, if you're not speaking up, if you could make sure your phone line is muted, otherwise we get a lot of background noise. And then I would ask if someone has a question to go right ahead and speak up.
Hi, Dave Eckert here from the Finger Lakes and Southern Tier BHCC. Can I ask a question?
Yes, go right ahead, Dave.
Thanks. We have a BHCC that is largely comprised of Oasis providers, and we'll have a website up and running soon where we'll list all the network and affiliates respectively. Just want to ensure, and I believe you've already covered this, but just want to put a stamp on it, that we'll be implementing the universal consent. And this will give permission, let's say if a client is treated at one agency that provide withdrawal detox services and then transferred down care to an outpatient substance use provider that under the umbrella of this consent can share, prior to us having IPA status while we're still a BHCC, they can share information between them as long as the universal consent is in place. Is that correct?
So, David, this is Mark Boss. So just so we're clear, when you're saying universal consent, you mean the BHCC consent. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yep, that's what I'm talking about.
And both of these providers are identified as members of the BHCC on the consent form or on the website?
Yep, there'll be network providers identified on the website.
Then yes, they can share the information.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Dave. Any other questions?
If they're part of the BHCC and they develop, their partners are listed on the website and they're using the BHCC consent and they develop an IPA.
So if you could speak a little closer to your phone, I actually couldn't hear your question. Could you repeat that? Mark or Erica, did you happen to hear that question?
I think that might have been an internal conversation.
Oh.
Hi.
Here's
Can I
another
ask a question? Oh.
Go for it.
My name's Pauline Clark, and I'm with an IPA in upstate New York. And we have 6 members that are primary care providers and also do some, behavioral health light, if you will. And then we also have 6 behavioral health agencies that are part of a BHCC. So together we have this IPA, which is sort of half PCP, half behavioral health. So I'm trying to think of, we want to be able to share information between the PCPs and the behavioral health as part of integrated care. So I'm trying to get clear with all these different consent forms that have been mentioned during the call. We have BAAs signed, amongst all these members. And, I'm just trying to get a sense of, would a universal consent do it? I mean, a BHCC doesn't make sense because it's really the IPA, with half from a BHCC. We're not so much a member of the BHCC as 6 of the BHCC members are part of the IPA. So can you kind of give me a little guidance?
So this is Mark. So yes, we've been talking about essentially exclusive BHCC consent for groups that have gathered together into BHCCs. But any consent can be constructed for multiple parties. That's what the BHCC consent is. So if your BHCC is rather small and you've got these other 6 entities that you'd like to incorporate, as long as they're listed either on the consent, if there's only really going to be 12 members, or in some other fashion, if you have a website, then you can incorporate all.
But whose website? The BHCC website or the IPA website?
Well, you're probably going to do the BHC, or this is a question for you. I mean, are you going to do the BHCC under the umbrella of the IPA?
Only 6 members from the BHCC, not the whole BHCC.
Okay. Well, then you probably want to do the IPA with your members of the IPA and the 6 members of the BHCC. So then it's really not the BHCC consent at that point.
Okay. So then it kind of becomes, because the reason I'm asking is because of the PSYCKES access. And it seems that the BHCC consent form is the only one that gives PSYCKES access.
Well, you can indicate that the client is agreeing that you can access PSYCKES on any consent form. You just have to be able to resolve that with PSYCKES themselves, that they acknowledge that you've got a right to access the information for that individual.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
And even though the title of this form is Behavioral Health Care Collaborative Patient Information Sharing Consent, we did in the first line, Mark, write name of Behavioral Health Care Collaborative / legal entity, because we had some questions like that, like I'd rather just say IPA on it, but we just handled that by saying / legal entity in the opening name line. So
Right.
could they use this form as their IPA consent form, do you think?
The way I understood the question is, right, you might have the whole universe of the IPA, but you don't have the whole universe of the BHC. So you've got people outside of the prominent universe that you're trying to pull into the consent. And if the group is small enough, you can just list them all out. Otherwise, somehow you have to identify that entity, which is the IPA plus these 6 additional members, as some kind of entity. We used to call them, the health homes or anything else. You have to define the universe that the person is signing the consent.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, this is Katie in Central New York. I just want to make sure that I'm clear on one piece. As long as the partners of the BHCC, whether they're network or affiliate, are listed on the website and they're treating an individual, we have the ability to share information.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So we have time for one more. Go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
No, that wasn't me.
That wasn't Mark. This is Herb Weiss calling from West New York. Maybe
All right,
this is a simplistic question. Sure.
Go for it.
Maybe a simplistic question, but what if a client says, well, I don't have access to the website?
Turn it off.
Yeah, in that situation, if I was their provider working with them, I would go on and print it out for them and then periodically give them the list. There's also the BHCC phone number on page 2. You would populate your BHCC phone number that they could call to get that information.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and I lied. We had time for one more question before we wrap this up. Any other questions out there? Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and especially big thanks to Erica and Mark and their teams. We will be circulating both the slides and the recording, as well as the updated BHCC consent form in a few days once our recording process wraps up. So stay tuned for that. As Erica said, feel free to reach out to both her and Mark if you do have questions. And if you're unable to get in touch with them, you can always email mctac.info, and we'll be happy to forward along your information or connect you to the right person to answer the question. So again, thank you to everyone for today's webinar, and we look forward to talking to you all again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.